So welcome all to the first Annenberg Conversation on race. We are excited to be here. I'm Sarah Jackson. I'm a presidential associate professor at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania and a co-director of the Media Inequality and Change Center. And I'll let Ben introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ben Jealous. I'm president of People for the American Way. I'm the former national president of the NAACP. I am a visiting lecturer I stutter on A's, but at Annenberg. And I also am a tech investor focused on social impact companies.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And we were actually talking earlier. Ben and I first met each other probably more years ago than we care to acknowledge at a conference called Netroots Nation, which is a conference that's specifically, came out of the ways in which progressive folks who are invested in progressive political issues were organizing online, leading up to, I think the first Obama election in 2008, and continues to exist. And so we were sort of swapping stories about that era of digital and online organizing because it was a very different era, but at the same time, that era very much set the tone for the current moment. Ben, so I would love for you to share the story that you told me about organizing about the Troy Davis case.
Yeah, sure.
Because I know in the #activism book, which just came out this year, my co-authors and I, one of the activist contributors really talked about how seeing people organizing online around Troy Davis's case was what really showed her the power of Twitter and other online online petitions and things like that. So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. And it's, that was, it was quite a moment for the NAACP because we had been kind of momentarily eclipsed by color change online in a major way. And that was the backdrop to me being at Netroots Nation, was going to meet with James Rucker, who we had grown up in the same NAACP chapter in California. His mom was the local president, and sort of connect kind of on the other side, if you will. But when I had worked the Troy Davis case for 15 years, it was easy for me to track because his nephew, Dejan Correa, was 3 and he was under ruse.
Can you give maybe some of the younger folks who are here who don't know about the Troy Davis case a little
Sure.
background?
Sure, yeah. And so when I met Troy's family, we were at an anti-death penalty conference. I was and I said to them what we said to a bunch of families, and we have a loved one, they're on death row, they're innocent. And what we said to them was, bring us the evidence and we'll fight like hell. And for various reasons, most folks didn't bring you the evidence. And so I'd stayed kind of connected to the case for years. And I say that the bookmarks were 15 years apart, and then kind of faded. And then became president of the NAACP, and I got a call from the Georgia NAACP president, and we have an innocent man on death row. He's about to be executed. Will you please get down here? He says the name Troy Davis. And again, I've been involved 15 years earlier, but the name didn't really click. It sounded familiar. But honestly, when I was at the National Coalition, I had summarized the clemency arguments for every person facing an execution. So all the names start to blend together. And I go on death row to meet Troy, and I meet with him, and I'm blown away by his piousness and his goodness. I've met with a lot of death row inmates. It's not a common experience. And then I walk out, and there's a teenage boy and his mother standing by a car, and they wave me over, and she introduces herself as Martina Correa. And she hands me a photograph. And she says, do you remember this photograph? I do. I said, remember that little boy in underoos? And she says, yeah, that's him. I go, oh my God. 15 years later, she said, I'm Troy's sister. I said, and she said, do you remember what you said to me that day? I said, yeah. I said, bring us the evidence and we'll fight like hell. And she clicks her trunk, and the trunk pops open, and there's all these organized files. And she says, well, here's the evidence. I need you to fight like hell. And so 3 months later, I was back down there to meet with the warden. We had dug into the case, and our Hail Mary was to get 60 minutes into the death row. The evidence was overwhelming. Troy had been put on death row by the eyewitness testimony of 9 individuals. Those files in the trunk were 7 of them recanting their testimony and saying that they had lied. The other 2 included one guy who was the primary alternative suspect. He was the other person suspected of killing this police officer, and somebody else who appeared to be his buddy, whose case was fanciful. And so I really leaned into the warden to try to get him to buckle and let 60 minutes in. And then he revealed the reason why he would not budge. He said, I was on the force. I was in law enforcement the night Officer McPhail was killed in Savannah, Georgia. It's been too long. Somebody's got to hang for it. Troy's going to die. And I said, well, I was just with your guards who are all crying because they know that he's innocent too. And there's an alternative, which is, we can let the wrong guy out, get the right guy in. And there's 4,000 people on death row. And while I'm generally opposed to executions, I'm not going to be leading protests over somebody who's guilty. And he said, no, that's honestly, they're crying because of you. I don't want them to be stressed out. 60 minutes is going to make them more stressed out. They're not fucking getting in. So we leave. And because of our work, the same reason we were at Netroots, the Obama campaign really inspired people about what was possible with digital organizing in a massive way.
Right.
And a half century earlier, there had been a case of a guy named Carl Chessman. And Carl, by the activists at the time, was compared to JFK. They said, he's like the JFK of death row. He's really figured out how to use television to champion his innocence, the way that JFK used television to champion his candidacy. And so we said, well, we just got to make Troy Davis the Obama of death row. And so we pulled together leaders from Amnesty with leaders from the NAACP, and we brainstormed, and we came up with a hashtag. And the hashtag was #TooMuchDoubt. That became the second most tweeted hashtag in the world. It tells you a little bit about who's on Twitter, because the most tweeted that year was Beyonce is pregnant.
And remind us what year this is, because this is
2011. This is 2011.
So this is like early adopter Twitter. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which was basically black folks. And the tipping point was when Russell Simmons tweeted about the case. Right after that, Kim Kardashian tweeted about the case, and it just sort of really took off. Troy would ultimately be executed. It's a whole other story. And Gallup would go into the field with a poll right after his execution. The execution was covered by all the major networks, minute by minute, that whole night. And it was a long night because Clarence Thomas, who's from Savannah, the same town, knows how racist it is, staged it for a minute and then like for an hour or two, and then let it proceed. A lot of drama that night. But 3 weeks later, Gallup goes in the field with a poll, and then ultimately there's a news article written about the results of the poll, which says public support for the death penalty has fallen to its lowest level since 1972. That's key because the death penalty was abolished for 4 years, from 72 to 76. And it's because of 3 things. And they talk about sort of like the activism and something else, and this hashtag #TooMuchDoubt. And that's why we were able to abolish the death penalty in Connecticut and Maryland the next year. Abolish it in Connecticut, despite the fact there was a high-profile capital case stemming from the murder of an heiress, the type of high-profile event that tends to stall any conversation about abolishing the death penalty until that trial's over and so forth, so for a few years. And abolishing it in Maryland, despite the fact that our state is below the Mason-Dixon, is a state that, Harriet Tubman ran away from many times and Frederick Douglass once. And while DC kind of suburbs can be pretty progressive, the rest of the state is distinctly Southern. Neither one of those would have been possible if public opinion hadn't cratered, and public opinion wouldn't have cratered in part without the hashtag #TooMuchDoubt.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's such a great story, and especially because it was in 2011, and I feel like a lot of elites, including academics and some mainstream media, didn't really start paying attention to the power that hashtags and Black folks on Twitter were having to shift public conversations until a few years after that. And of course, the irony of that was that the Arab Spring, what's colloquially known as the Arab Spring, happened over December 2010, January 2011, and we very much saw that it did matter to public consciousness what people were doing on Twitter. I mean, you mentioned that many of the early adopters of Twitter were African Americans, but also many of the early adopters of Twitter were young folks and also folks who worked in media. And so, something that we saw and that we argue in the hashtag activism book is that because so many journalists and media makers have been on Twitter, that often when things trend on Twitter or when things really become popular and important on Twitter, they become a part of mainstream public discourse. And that's exactly what happened with the Troy Davis case, which really very few people outside of advocacy organizations and activist organizations on the ground were talking about. We've seen that over and over again in more recent cases. So I wonder what you think about folks now who sort of argue that these digital spaces have kind of lost their efficacy because now the demographics of Twitter are, of course, very different. And we've also seen, in response to how effectively progressives were using, Twitter from the beginning, we've seen the opposite forces, the far right, conservatives, others sort of really also learn to employ these tools for political means. And so do you think that in this moment we're having as effective of an impact on public consciousness and sort of inserting ourselves in activist debates through digital spaces, or do you think that terrain has changed?
I think it's exceedingly relevant that the medium of the moment shifts. I'm a Gen Xer who misses my BlackBerry, and as I get comfortable with Twitter because it's just sort of like text. My daughter, is 14. It's for her generation. It's Instagram, it's TikTok, it's a whole bunch of other things. But there's no doubt that online activism moves ideas, it shifts opinions. You can't sleep on it. And again, I could never denigrate it because, which was, I think, common back in 2010. People are like, well, tweeting, like what, huh? But in 96, when I was working at the National Coalition, that year we sent out a viral email. We even have the word viral. It was just like, the end said, please forward to all your friends and media contacts. And it was about a 16-year-old South African who was being prosecuted for the death penalty as an accomplice in Mississippi. And that story became the first death penalty case on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in 20 years because of that email. And we also raised $20,000 for his defense. And by the way, now he's free and in South Africa, and part of them because of the money that we raised online. So I was an early believer in the power of the internet, but I'd seen nothing like the Troy Davis case, where it wasn't just about the case in Georgia. We shifted the opinion of the entire country and made it possible far north in the upsouth like Maryland and even in New England like Connecticut to achieve things that were thought to be impossible.
Yeah.
And the town square is more crowded. There's more groups in it, but it's still super important. In fact, maybe more important because it's more crowded.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a great book by Dave Karp at GW called The Move On Effect, where he sort of traces some of that early successful online advocacy. But this was also, having a book about online activism come out in 2020. This is a question that my co-authors and I for hashtag activism have faced a lot about how do you actually measure the political change. And so one of the arguments we always get is, well, okay, so maybe it's changing public discourse, maybe it's changing public opinion, but do you have any evidence that that has an impact on public policy? Now, of course, as somebody who is a scholar who studies the importance of communication to policy and politics and knows very much that discourse shapes ideology and the potential policies and laws that people will or will not support, to me, I'm always a little taken aback by that question because it seems like an obvious thing to me, but it does seem to be something that people are very concerned about, sort of more traditionally defined ways of understanding politics that have to do with policy and law. And I mean, this is something, you know, you worked in this kind of, this intersection of, you know, advocacy and organizing for social justice and racial justice issues alongside being involved in these tech spaces for a really long time. And so I wonder what you think about that question of, you know, the policy itself. I mean, you just said you think that part of why Maryland and Connecticut voted to abolish the death penalty was because of some of this.
But, I mean, Gallup measured it, right? I mean, that was what was sort of amazing about this case study, is that you had this, you know, this individual case in the midst of an ongoing movement to abolish the death penalty, frankly, where the inmate himself, it's a key part of the story I didn't mention. I apologize, the background noise, my little son came in. My house is like Swiss Family Robinson during COVID.
I have 2 dogs in the room with me, so.
Okay, all right, great. And so you know, so after I had that meeting with the warden, I was so shook. I go into Troy's cell to say goodbye and to talk to him. And Troy says, Ben, this is Georgia. Like, death row's taught me anything. He was on death row almost 20 years. He's like, this is Georgia, Ben. Ben, they will, I mean, there's actually a song, if you think about it, right? There's a song called The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. That's the night they killed an innocent man. Like, there's an anthem for killing innocent people on death row in Georgia, right? And so he's like, just like recognize that they're going to kill me if they want to. He's like, what's important is that not just that you fight to save my life, which I was laser focused on, but that you also make sure that the world knows my name.
Yeah.
He said, because we have to stop the machinery of death. He was the son of an NAACP activist. He had grown up in an activist family. He was not, you know, a saint by any stretch, but he also didn't kill Officer McPhail. And he had a movement mindset, and that made a big difference, because that was part of what made me so determined to figure out how to get his name out there. And so in this case, I think other times you might have to guess what the impact was of any tactic, whether it's online or whether it was the protest you had or the letter writing campaign. But when we had the Gallup Institution run a poll and they identified one of the factors was the hashtag, it just, you know,
yeah, and I mean, you see that more recently. You see that with more recent Pew and Gallup polls, where since 2014, when Michael Brown was killed, which was really the moment, even though the Black Lives Matter hashtag and the movement for Black Lives had existed previous to that and really sprung up and started coalition building, particularly around the Trayvon Martin case in 2012, in 2014, we really started to see that more Americans, particularly white Americans outside of cities, who increasingly were on some of these same spaces, were being introduced to these new ideas and really becoming aware and sort of rethinking. And I think one of the really interesting things that we saw, just to fast forward from 2011 to 2020, you know, this summer, obviously, we all, beyond COVID, and we can talk about COVID and some racial justice stuff a little later, but beyond COVID, we all experienced what, at least I felt in my lifetime, was the most intense and most diverse uprising in the streets around racial justice issues. And very much people, you know, the argument that the digital activism is just not as important really seems to be being let go of, because people have a hashtag, you know, on their front lawns and hanging from their front porches and as part of their political platforms. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about then, like how we're thinking about the current moment, because obviously there are a lot of different political contexts, including a very, very different president. There's COVID, there's a new generation of young people that are using platforms that frankly, I'm too old to be on, like TikTok, to also engage in this kind of racial justice discourse. And I'm just wondering how, for you in your current role in organization and sort of reflecting back, you're seeing that come up in the work you're doing in the moment.
Well, if you hadn't said you were too old, I wouldn't have known it. But, so video has become incredibly important. When 2011, phones were less sophisticated, and it was really about texts, on Twitter and making points, and now, with police brutality, going back to 2015, 2016, right? Before Trump dominated everything, what you really saw was the crescendo of about 25 years of people being subjected to video, starting with the Rodney King case and sort of traditional news media, moving on, to the internet and ultimately onto their cell phones and social. Just kind of ending the argument about whether police brutality is a real problem, or whether it's just those people, provoked that officer. Yeah. And that's been incredibly powerful. I mean, and then you see it erupt again, finally break through the sort of Trump news block of the last several years. This summer, George Floyd. Right now, you can watch 9 minutes, 8 minutes, 46 seconds of a man being murdered, and there's just no question that that's what's happening, right? And leading a social change organization now, right? People for the American Way, where 40-year-old civil rights organization founded by a Black congresswoman who was like the AOC of her day, Barbara Jordan, and a white filmmaker, Norman Lear. And my predecessor actually was a Hollywood exec who kind of ran away in many ways. He's a great man, a great leader, but he just wanted to really focus on sort of the tools of Washington. And what I've been saying to the board is like, we need to take everything that he built and everything that Norman is, and we got to mash it together, because the future of organizing for us is probably 60% digital. Everything that we're doing with Right Wing Watch, where we employ journalists to monitor the right wing, I'm about to shift to video in a massive way. We just had the Lincoln Project make their latest ad based on our footage. But again, we kind of catalog it like academics, and we're about to shift how we do that. And I was just having a conversation with some of the leading programmers in the Valley a couple of days ago about the fact that we really need a team of organizers working here to really help us move ideas in the most effective way, and quite frankly, elect candidates in the most effective way. We're just endorsed 144 candidates running for office across the country. These are young people under 35 to end police brutality. And when I'm trying to figure out how to move dollars most effectively to help them, like programmers would help. So, it's like digital activism is only going to get more and more steam. And of course, during COVID, what's happening is our lives are just becoming inherently more digital. I think we're probably gonna have to write like an update on the book in about a year.
I mean, honestly, like I've been saying, I wish we didn't have COVID. Obviously, I wish all of it could be undone. And frankly, I wish none of these cases existed for you and I to be, writing about or advocating around or et cetera. But this year has very much shown that the idea, the sort of classic binary, there was this piece, and I think you kind of nodded to it earlier, that Malcolm Gladwell wrote in 2010 that was something like the revolution will not be tweeted. And his argument was basically like, you'll never make big change through these channels. It has to be on the streets. It has to be through traditional, social movement and policy strategy. And what I always tell my students is like, these things aren't mutually exclusive. Like when we talk about being on the streets, using our bodies in activism, policy, lobbying, all these things, they actually in the 21st century go hand in hand with digital media, just like they always went hand in hand with, traditional media like television. I mean, the role that television images of nonviolent protesters during the civil rights movement being attacked by police and fire hoses and dogs played in sort of raising public's consciousness at that period was significant. And so the idea that just because the platform has changed, that isn't as just the same part of the formula is something that, I think COVID has really shown us that just cannot be the case. This is the era that we very, very much live in. But I wanted to ask you about TV though, because you mentioned the importance of images. And I was just looking at a Pew Research study from just this past year, 2019, that said, despite the fact that many of us, depending on what areas we're in, get a lot of our news from digital media now. But the majority of Americans actually still report that they get their news from television. And it's decreasing and has decreased significantly for the past 10 years, but it's still the platform that most Americans get their news from. And so I'm wondering what the challenges of that are for the type of work, the type of racial justice work you're doing. And particularly, I think, we could spend a whole hour talking about the way that cable news has changed the format of what television looks like and changed what television audiences look like. But just in general, do you see the television, because like you mentioned the Lincoln Project, and I don't even know, are the Lincoln Project ads actually being run on TV, or is it just digital? Are you all running spots on TV, or are you just doing digital? How are you managing that?
Yeah, so we're doing all of it. Most of our television advertising is actually Spanish language. And I think the biggest problem on the left is that we think like politicians or political organizers, which is to say, if you're running a campaign, you say, are we winning the women? Are we winning the blacks? Are we winning, are we winning the Latinos? And they wouldn't say Latinx, they would say Latinos, and think that's an improvement because they really want to say Hispanic, And so, and winning means 51%. But if you want to become president of the United States, a Democrat, you need 70% of Latinos. Trump knows that, by the way. He's clearly, because on their side, they're approaching this like marketers. And they're saying, who's buying what we're selling? Oh, I can sell a little bit to some black men over here and to some, into some Latinx men over there. And, I got a whole lot of old white dudes over here. And let's sell to all of them. Where for us, it's really just this kind of old sort of machine politics. Are we getting most of this demographic, that demographic, that demographic? And then we'll forget about some other ones because we don't think that we can win them. Mm-hmm. Rather than asking, again, the marketer would say, okay, if Hillary was at 70% with the Latinx community, how do we push that to 80? But when you just ask, are we winning? It can drop to 60, which is what has happened. And you don't even realize what a threat you're in. So right now, on Spanish language television and radio, Trump is outspending Biden 10-1. So one of my biggest jobs is running around the country trying to find people who can write checks to help me make up that gap for the Biden effort, because the campaign, which is raising money much more fluidly than I am, just still has a blind spot.
Which is that's such a testament to the continued importance of traditional media like radio and television, especially for reaching niche audiences. When you see that big of a difference in spending, that makes me a little anxious. But that's
and then for young black folks, right? You want to get really anxious? Consider this. If you're black and you're over 30, there's a 70% chance you should vote. And first of all, it should be 96, because with black women over 30, it's often been that high. But it's 70%. But if you're a black person under 30, there's a 50% chance that you're going to vote. Mm-hmm. And which is scary, because it should be much higher. It has been much higher. And so we're buying a bunch of radio ads targeting black folks under 30 years old. Yeah, so I'd say, for ethnic audiences, but just kind of like smart marketing, like you've got to really think about who specifically you're trying to reach and then get them. For Black men, I mean, as of Tuesday, just in a week, we had reached every Black male unlikely voter under 40 in 12 states with text messages to their cell phone. And then we were going back with digital ads tied to their cell phone numbers. And you've got to be doing all of it. And honestly, if you just assume, like a lot of people, like people just forget that Latinx media exists, Latinx Spanish language radio and television. I was in an argument with some donor advisors to a billionaire who were just like, your numbers are too low. They can't be realistic. What the issue was is they were trying to reach people who primarily conduct their lives in Spanish. These are Spanish-speaking Latinx swing voters, typically first-generation immigrants, through general market media. Well, of course, whoever's doing that for you is telling you it's wildly expensive. That's the most inefficient thing I've ever heard. You know what? Like that, just like in the Black community, and I come out of Black newspapers. I ran their trade association when I was young, and their national news service, and I was cut my teeth at the Jackson Advocate newspaper. And our community newspapers, whether it's the Latinx community, the Black community, the LGBTQ community, much cheaper. And the same thing is true of the television and the radio that's targeted at those communities as well.
And I think, we'll reach people in a very different way because of sort of the enclave nature in which they allow for intercommunity debate along sort of the language or cultural or historical terms that particular communities adhere to. And I mean, I think that's something that is remarkable too about the digital space, is that we've seen people build those similar kind of spaces. People talk about Black Twitter, of course, as one example, but there's similarly like Latinx Twitter, and there's similarly like, the LGBTQ blogosphere and the feminist blogosphere, and there's all these spaces where you really can reach particular audiences and particular identities better. Yeah, if you know how to do it. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, thanks, Ben. This has been really great. I'm trying to think if there's anything that we had talked about wanting to discuss that we've left out here. I mean, I think maybe we should talk a little bit just about some of I know that myself and my students, although I don't want to speak for them, I think sometimes there's a real feeling of pessimism in this moment. This has been a really tough year with COVID. It has been a tough year in terms of just the racial battle fatigue and just the open and sort of emboldened level of racism and misogyny and homophobia and all the rest, transphobia. We saw yesterday this, I'm putting in militia, but they're a domestic terrorist group plotting to kidnap a governor because of, her COVID lockdown policies. And so I'm wondering, like, what are you feeling hopeful about? I think we should end before we open up for questions, maybe talking about what we're feeling optimistic about and what we think the future might look like in terms of just organizing around racial justice issues and media.
It's funny, when I'm really challenged in a situation, I'm blessed to be able to go to my grandma. Maybe I'll show you a picture of her. So this is my grandma. She graduated from Penn in 1953. She commuted up on the trains. My grandfather was a sleeping car porter. They lived in the tenements of West Baltimore. And she descends from Thomas Jefferson's grandmother by her other grandchildren that were her slaves. My grandmother's grandparents and great-grandparents were slaves. She turns 104 a week after the election. And she's sharp. She went to the Penn School of Social Work, now it's SP2, and she would return to Maryland to train a much younger social worker named Barbara Mikulski. Grandmother was a leading activist in Baltimore back in the day. And when you go to my grandma with a big problem, somehow you always end up back on the farm she grew up on in Southern Virginia. And what my grandma would tell you is, in dark times, what you have to remember is it's always darkest before the dawn. On the farm, they would start their work in the black of the pre-dawn to get ready for the day that would begin when the roosters would wake up and everything would come back to life when dawn broke. And she said, you have to sort of take faith in the darkness that the dawn is coming. Now, as an organizer, what she taught me, my grandmother is a third generation member of the NAACP. I'm a fifth. Her daughter, my mom, sued her high school when she was 12 and desegregated when she was 15. Like, we've been, in this movement for a long time. And what I would tell you is that the job of activists is to make the future come faster.
Yeah.
And what she says is like, look, if you're on this, she lives now on the balcony of history, right? She's in a retirement home that she refers to as the hereafter. She said like Baltimore was my here, and this is after that. She's near my parents now in California. She's like, so I'm in the hereafter. And what she would say is, what she says is, we're in the century when white supremacy ceases to be the operating system of our democracy. 4 centuries before this, all the way through the 1980s, white men decided who was president. And then it started to fall apart, and you needed women too, or you needed people of color. And that's what's happened. Donald Trump can't win just with white men. He would love to, but he's got to recruit in some black men and some Latinx men and some women and so forth. And by the middle of this century, well, white folks will be a minority too. And every group's going to have to get along demographically with at least one other group to succeed democratically. So, if you're 25 years before that point, well, you would expect that the right wing would begin to act like a fox backed into a corner.
Yeah.
Just by the shifting demographics. But ultimately, when you see a fox lashing out, they're usually kind of mischievous, quiet creatures. But when you see them lashing out, that means that you're about to win, and the fox knows it. Mm. And so that's where you got to get your faith from, is you get your faith from the darkness. You get your faith from the fact that the other side is fighting so viciously. Mm. Because what it means is that they know what you know, which is a better future is coming, and all they can hope to do is slow it down. Yeah. And as good organizers, our job is, and activists and believers in a better day, our job is simply to speed up the future. And if you just focus on that, it's actually much easier than you think.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. That's lovely. And it was nice to virtually sort of meet your grandmother. I mean, awesome. For me, one of the things I try to tell my students, especially, I teach a class on social movements at the undergraduate level, and it really helps to have that long vision of history, because I think sometimes it's easy in the moment to forget that there have been other moments. I have this conversation with my students every time I teach that class, which is, imagine being a young person fighting for social change and social justice in the late 1960s, when John F. Kennedy is murdered, and then Martin Luther King is murdered, and then Bobby Kennedy is murdered, and then Malcolm X is murdered, and then
well, and a whole bunch of other people who we
and the Vietnam War, right, and a whole bunch of other people are murdered, right, and the Vietnam War is going on, and the National Guard is shooting students on their campuses as they're protesting.
And you were probably born into the era of lynching as well.
Right, exactly. So, and which is not, of course, in any way to downplay the severity of this moment, because frankly, this moment is just unbelievably severe, in my opinion. But which is to say, what we saw in that moment was people refusing to give up, and people continuing to push, and people continuing to fight, and really facing what they, in that moment, also thought were these insurmountable and unbelievable kind of things, and yet they made things better. And so I think that that's something that I try to tell them to hold on to, is like, we can do the same thing in this moment, in this generation.
And what they did is they simply made a better future come faster.
Yeah.
There's no holding off the future. They can't destroy the future. They can't prevent the future. They know that. The Koch brothers, they just want to hold it off till they die. And so our job is just to keep making the future come faster.
Right, great. Okay, well, I think that's a good place. And hello to our visitor. I think that's a good place. We're going to go ahead now, folks, and open up the chat so that if folks have questions for us, you can direct them at Ben, you can direct them at me, you can direct them at Cole. The chat should now, I think, be enabled. so that you can type your questions into the chat. If you prefer to come on video and unmute, that is okay as well. We are being sensitive to security issues, so if we don't know who you are, we may keep you muted until we have established that. But you are welcome to jump right in. And I think I actually see Kathleen Hall Jameson was the first to unmute her video. So go ahead, Kathleen.
Hi, Ben. After the presentation is over, if you would just send me an email, I have some information that maybe have helped you. But my question is as you think about the racial disparities that we're seeing in infection rates, hospitalization rates, and death rates within communities of color, are there things that the kind of advocacy that you have marshaled can teach us about how better to help those communities overcome all of the biases inherent in this system, including those involved in deciding whether and when to take a vaccination from a system that historically should not be trusted by communities of color because it's had so much racism in it?
Yeah, you know, so I'm an advisor to a company called Citizen.com. It's a public safety app that's been involved, gotten into the symptom tracking, contact tracing space. And one of the things we saw early on was that because we can see our users geographically, was that there were these hotspots and housing projects and other places that were portending what would come out later, which is like for my demographic of Black folks, Sarah's as well, you know, Black folks 35 to 54, our death rate is 10x that of our white peers. And you can't explain all of it by disproportionate representation in prison or lack of access to health care. With that said, I think honestly, as an organizer, what I'll be focused on in this moment is sure some short-term fixes to the crisis, but also building consensus for the long-term fixes, like the bigger fixes that we might be able to get through. For instance, if Democrats take back the Senate and the White House. I think we have to take a lesson from FDR. And I would say two. One is that in the midst of a crisis, well, that's the time to really think about the big changes to our society, like Medicare for all, you know, like making the internet like water, you know, universally available, high quality, and low cost. But also, you know, when FDR gave a speech on the four freedoms, you know, he would privately identify that the fourth one, freedom from want, would be the hard work, harder than freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from hate. It's also what Martin Luther King identified as the hard work, and what he was leading with his Poor People's Campaign when he was assassinated. And so I think for those of us who exist in the politics, anywhere from maybe a little right of center to the far left, we have to, those folks who are inspired by folks like FDR, like King, like Ella Baker, and so forth, you know, Bayard Rustin, need to really just admit that in this time when trillionaires are like a thing we talk about, and billionaires are amassing massive wealth, there's just no getting that the racial disparities are both real, and also Black folks are, as Professor Derek Bell said, the canaries in the coal mine. We're the ones, you know, who just simply are the sign that there's a bigger problem we have to deal with. And when I've raised money here in Baltimore, raised about $1 million, little over, to help poor families. And what blows you away is, one, the diversity. It is everybody, and how nice their cars are, because all these folks had jobs like 6-7 months ago. And in many cases, the ones who are in more crisis aren't the lower level workers for whom, you know, unemployment has kind of stabilized. It's the middle income and kind of upper middle class folks who are like managing hotels and so forth, who have been just devastated. And so there is, I think, a time of political consensus building where we can actually build consensus, not just for crisis response, but also for wholesale change.
Thanks. Thank you, Ben. Michael has a question in the chat, asked, can we talk about the disparity in tech access in the move towards racial equality? I'm happy to start off on that and then kick it to you. I think this is a great question because I get to say this thing that, you know, us nerdy academics get to say, which is that the sort of the line that we depend on to answer this has really changed. There used to be this discourse about the digital divide and the idea of the digital divide. And there was a lot of hand-wringing and research on the digital divide and how, particularly, of course, we know globally the digital divide is real, but in the case of the United States, that poor folks and folks of color in the early days of the internet were, you know, least likely to have computers at home, were least likely to attend schools where they had access to sort of the technological know-how to use those technologies. But what we've seen in the last 2 decades is actually a pretty significant and notable shift on this. And a lot of scholars who study the digital divide have sort of had to adjust their thinking, because with the popularity and an increased affordability of smartphones and being able to get the internet on a smartphone, and this is you know, part of why now what we see is a disproportionate number of, for example, African Americans on platforms like Twitter, because you can get right on the internet and participate in the public sphere from your phone. It has broken down some of those early logics around who is and who isn't on the internet. Now, of course, there are still larger concerns that are applicable from the original digital divide literature. But one of the things that came up during COVID, of course, this summer, was that really this question of the digital divide has become mostly about rural areas that aren't set up to have broadband internet access, where homes aren't within, you know, the satellites that will cover them for internet access, and people having to sort of, you know, drive to the local McDonald's for their kids to go to Zoom school, or, you know, to get on to check their email. And so I think this is a really complicated question, because on the one hand, we see an increase of previously excluded demographic groups, including groups of color, from the public sphere through smartphone technology and other, like, the ubiquity of other technology. But we continue to see a very much a class divide and a rural-urban divide in some places around this. Have you all run into this, Ben, in your organizing work and activism?
Sure. I mean, right here in Baltimore, when you go in the poor areas, what you'll see is that they're broadcasting internet like from the top of the library, and people just like in those rural areas, like the McDonald you mentioned, are driving up so that their kids can learn. And, you know, so far we've gone through it in the spring and summer, so it's fairly humane. But when we get into the depths of winter, it's going to be very, very rough. Comcast is a notorious discriminator in places like Baltimore. They just simply don't even make it possible in the housing projects where my mom grew up in West Baltimore to you know, to get their service, period.
Yeah.
And so what you're finding is, you know, kids are silenced in their education. Sure, they can watch their class on their mom's cell phone or their cell phone, but their data is quickly ratcheted by the company, and all they can get is the voice of the teacher, and they have to turn off their video, you know, things like that. I mean, it's a mess. You know, I'm sure that there are rural areas that have been taken down to zero. In the hood, it's not that it's zero, but maybe it's 10 or 20% of what you get somewhere else. And that's a problem.
Yeah, it's so clear that we need to treat internet access as a basic human right. It's so clear. And this is something that I think the US is actually behind on, among other things, is that this is clearly the right to participate in politics, education, you know, the public sphere, whatever, however you want to frame it, is a right in a democracy. That in this era, the fact that internet is so expensive, and the fact that particular communities have more difficult time accessing it, is a rights violation. I mean, I see it as a human rights violation. So
yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Any other questions? Any other folks want to? I think we have time for a couple more if folks want to jump in. You can jump in the chat or unmute video, either way.
We've got, I think, a question from a reporter. Sure, to the reporter from the Daily Pennsylvanian, you can pin the video and take a screenshot.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a question?
No, right now, I think my role is more to report, so we're told not to ask questions, but thank you.
Sure.
Any other folks want to jump in? Questions about technology, protest, organizing? I could ask Ben questions probably forever. I think we could just chat.
Let me ask you some questions. Like,
Okay.
What do you think that folks who are leading activists, says, like I am not a leading activist, but leading other activists, should understand is coming next? Like, where do you think all of this is headed? What's next?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I actually just wrote a piece about leadership and how the concept of leadership is being not reinvented, but re-explored in this moment in sort of within the movement for Black lives. And I do a lot of this again, because as I mentioned, I know the social movement history. And so I do a lot of kind of corrective, but gentle corrective people when people say, well, now, there's intersectionality in the movement, and now there's women leaders, and now there's this, which is, we know that was actually always the case. Folks like Ella Baker, folks like Bayard Rustin, folks like Fannie Lou Hamer were always actually at the forefront of sort of innovating and leading in a very
Diane Nash,
in a very, very, very grassroots type of way that was very much about lifting up the needs and experiences of ordinary people. But a lot of folks in the US have received this education that privileges the elite style of leadership that, folks recognize in people like Martin Luther King. And because of that, and we've seen how this has actually been politically harmful, because we see the right take up figures like King, for example, of course, in ways that he would hate, but also to say there's only one style of activism, there's only one style of leadership, this is what it looks like, it comes out of the church, it's masculine, it's this and this. And so we're in this interesting moment of leadership where I actually think the US, and in part through digital spaces, in part through the work that people online are doing to introduce folks who maybe aren't in the college classrooms to learn it, to concepts around grassroots organizing and intersectionality. And of course, you have to give a huge nod to all the community level activists, because I think that is one of the most important things, is that all those folks we mentioned, like Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer and others, were really focused on local communities. The power that local communities had, and Ella Baker sort of infamously critiqued King and some of the other SNCC leaders for coming into communities that weren't their own and trying to sort of take over and lead, when the community members know best sort of what those communities need. And I think we're just seeing a re-embrace of that in this moment, where rather than having single, and I mean, you can probably talk about what your experience is in this, but what I see is rather than having single organizations, we really are seeing coalitions of local organizations. We're seeing lots of young people that are sort of organizing much more along the lines of SNCC than along the lines of the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, right? And very much, yeah, and we're very much seeing this sort of the localized work. And that's part of, I think, why this summer's protests were so remarkable, is because what folks who were paying attention saw was, it's not just Philadelphia and DC and New York and Oakland and LA where we think of these kind of organizing and activist spaces arising, but small towns all over America, in rural towns, in suburbs, in middle America, in the Midwest, in the Mountain West, these protests were erupting in part because of the ways in which the local organizers have really been able to pick up and focus on, whatever sort of local cases or issues matter to them. So, I mean, I think, it's funny, I think that's like the future, but it's also the past. It's just the past that, we haven't done a good enough job teaching and acknowledging that was a huge part of how organizing successes happened before,
No, it's exactly right. I mean, I think one of the things that people miss, that I see in part, because again, 5th generation member of the NAACP, my mom grew up in the NAACP, was also very active in SNCC. And when I I spent 5 years, 6 years really rebaptizing NAACP activists, including our youth and college division, in championing the cases of individuals. It wasn't just Troy Davis, it was the Scott sisters, it was John McNeil. It was a host of cases. I had come, most recently, my activism kind of leadership had been at Amnesty International. And it was just, and Amnesty, of course, I learned from the old NAACP about sort of the power of championing individual cases. We brought back to that. When I left, after the Trayvon Martin case was the last big one, I think it was, BLM, what rises up, 2014-ish, right? 2015, somewhere in there.
Yeah, for most people, that's when they definitely became conscious of it. For sure, it was 2014.
Yeah, and you turn on the TV, and there were all these NAACP youth and college leaders who are now BLM leaders across the country, just as happened with SNCC. And what it reminds you is that activism is like a forest. For the NAACP is like the old kind of knotty redwood in the Black community. Like, it's not very attractive. It's easy to take for granted. It's been there forever, and yet it's hard to imagine how the forest works without it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, as you were talking about SNCC and that style of organizing, of course, Ella Baker had started with the NAACP, right? And so had Julian Bond and many of those organizers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that is we're out of time, and I want to respect and honor people's, lunch times, because I'm sure while other folks may have been eating while we were doing this, we haven't been eating. I think that that's a great point. And I think it's so important to remember that there's this nuance that, there are a lot of really, really remarkable new organizations, the Dream Defenders, for example, in Florida, the BYP in Chicago, all these really fantastic organizations, but that they are part of a network. Just like we talk about these digital networks as being really important online, these offline networks of community organizations, state organizations, national organizations, and sort of the mentorship and leadership training that happens within them, and the ways in which we're really seeing, and I recently had the chance to do an interview with Alicia Garza, who folks will know as one of the co-founders of the movement for Black Lives, although she rejects the language of founder because she talks about how she's just part of this legacy of this larger movement, but she very much talked about how she and Patrice Coolers and Opal all had these trainings in other types of organizing at the local level. And that brought them to the moment, when we started thinking about and talking about, police brutality in this new way in the contemporary moment. And so the sort of mentorship and community in the grassroots has connected them, but so have these larger networks and histories of activist organizing. So
and again, I think the metaphor of ecology, which we use a lot in tech, holds for activism too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Ben. This was great. I feel like the time went by quicker than I expected. I hope folks have something to think about, something useful. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I think at one point we had 58 people on. Appreciate the claps. Thanks, Kelly. Everyone, please, be well and do good. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
It's a real honor.
Thanks.